All right, welcome back in to Last Call. Kristen Reed, Hallie is here, of course, beat writer for Cowboy basketball. And, of course, now from Kansas, we have Jack Nadeau. For those that maybe remember, Jack actually came on, talked with Reed and I about KU football when the Cowboys were playing them up in Lawrence earlier in the fall. So, Jack, thanks again for coming back on.
Yeah, no problem, y'all. Thanks for having me back.
So I guess I'm gonna hit the hard hitting question. What's been the mood now that the news has been out that LeGerald Vick is kind of taking a personal leave of absence for a while from the program?
Well, guys, this is quite a shock. Obviously, to everyone, the news really came out of nowhere. But the biggest issue is just how many problems have come up along the way for Kansas, and it's just really snowballed to the point where there's just a lot of things in question. It reminds me of the 2017-2018 season last year when KU lost. They lost Billy Preston early on, and depth was a big issue. And then with the strong recruiting class and the guys that had returning, everyone was excited for the potential, and now it's looking a lot different. Let's just say that.
How much is it hard to knowing that Azubuike only played, I think it was 9 games this season. How much has it been sometimes frustrating at times knowing he comes back, he forgoes going to the draft and comes back, he plays 9 games, and now he's done again for the season?
I feel bad for him, biggest of all, to have just a history of injuries, but it's the toughest. Also thinking about his future, because that sophomore junior year, that's the time when you're really starting to think for guys that aren't shoo-ins for an NBA prospect. That's the time where they need to kind of show off. That's their contract year for their future, and he doesn't really have that opportunity now, and that's causing a lot of people to think that he may return, or at the very least seek other opportunities to get himself ready, just because he won't have that season here.
Jack, I told you when we talked in the fall, with football, it seems like, Oklahoma State obviously had the upper hand. And I have some football questions I want to ask you, because I think we could all agree you improved a little bit since the last time we talked. But now Kansas obviously has the upper hand in basketball, because, Oklahoma State does not have near the history that Kansas does, although they've been able to upset them at times. And the Cowboys have had their problems as well, especially with the assistant coach getting arrested. They've dealt with this NCAA investigation. They have 7 players on the team. They are really struggling as well. But this is not Kansas, because if you Google Kansas basketball, the last, all the stories are Silvio De Souza, the NCAA. The athletic department's upset about that. You got LeGerald Vick. You lose to Kansas State. This doesn't feel like Kansas basketball. But I'm going to ask you really quickly, everyone in this room around here is trying to convince me that Kansas State is going to win the Big 12. And I don't care what headline there is tomorrow, what it is the next day. I will not believe that Kansas will not win the Big 12. They could be 5 games behind going with 1 game left, and I would put all my money on the Jayhawks. Tell me how they can win the Big 12.
Well, for Kansas, it's going to be about guys coming around to form and playing to their potential, because, obviously they're a depleted unit right now, but the biggest thing is that they still have guys healthy, active on the roster that should be able to perform and to win games. But it's just been a story of underperforming, and it's really kind of extended all year long. When you have a younger team, or a team that doesn't have a lot of experience playing together, you would expect to see progression throughout the season as they continue, and to see guys really evolving into their skill sets. And for Kansas, it's just really not been that. So for them to be successful and to make a run at number 15 in a row atop the Big 12, it's going to be guys like Quentin Grimes, who's a blue chip recruit, top 15 in the nation, and he's gotten to the point where if there were other players to start over him, I don't even know if he would be starting. And Devon Dotson, another top prospect, again, really hasn't found consistency. He's gotten better, but just really isn't there yet. And then Dedrick Lawson, a guy that everyone thought would be, a potential player, a National Player of the Year candidate. He's been great at times, and he's been non-existent at times. So for Kansas, it's going to be, they're going to need everyone rolling on all cylinders at the right time, and then actually playing up to their talent and their potential.
So, a week ago, number 16 Texas Tech comes into town, and they were maybe the second favorite going into all this. Kansas State was getting a lot of love in the offseason as well. But really, sure. Kansas beat the Red Raiders down. And it felt to me like, hey, we're back on track here because, quite honestly, if you're looking at the schedule, they've had a lot of wins, right? They're 17-6, yep. But they really haven't blown a ton of people out, especially in the Big 12. Texas Tech, it felt like they got on track. What happened between that game and the short bus ride over to Manhattan?
Honestly, I really couldn't tell you because, like you said, that was, for at least a lot of people, and I know a lot of the beat writers here in town thought that was a turning point for this team. They had just came off the news that Silvio De Sousa was ruled ineligible, and a lot of people thought they were kind of playing with something to prove. Now that they were for sure going to be down another player, but it was just turnovers that really killed them in Manhattan, and that's the thing that I think they had 23 turnovers the entire game, and any game, any team where you turn over the ball 20 times, unless you have a roster of 10 5-star recruits, it's going to be pretty tough for you to overcome that kind of mistake. So for them, just turnovers, inconsistency, and we saw guys like LaGerald Vick again disappear in moments that they needed them the most.
So you're talking about, Silvio gets ruled ineligible. They get that big win. LaGerald Vick is personal reasons. Have you heard anything as to what? I know it's just kind of fresh on everyone's mind, just a couple hours old, but have you heard anything about what the true reason is that he's walked away from the team?
No, they're keeping things pretty confidential, and in the press release they said that they would respect his privacy during this time with his absence. But I know one of the newspapers in town reached out to his mom, who's very active on Twitter and kind of a mini celebrity here in Lawrence. All she said was that he's needed at home. There's some matters that they need to take care of for a couple weeks. There's a lot going on. It'll work out. But that's all that she commented. And she's been silent on Twitter, and she's usually always active. So no one really knows what's going on behind the scenes. But you have to imagine it's something pretty significant for him to leave at this point in the season. And it's just really also troubling to think that he was really the only player with extensive experience on this roster. Dedrick Lawson played in Memphis, then took a year off. Charlie Moore played at Cal, took a year off. And other than LaGerald Vick, not a lot of these guys have really, had their guts tested at any point in their careers. A lot of these guys are fresh out of high school or transferred and such, and have never been in big moments. So it's just putting a lot of stress and a lot of pressure on a team that's really battled through a lot of adversity here in the last couple of weeks.
So talking kind of a little bit about LaGerald and him joining kind of that one person, you had Perry Ellis a few years back that was there for 4 years. You
felt like 10.
Yeah, it felt like forever. Frank Mason the third, and then just Devontae Graham last year, and now you'd have LaGerald Vick this year. Who's maybe that next person now on this roster that's going to be that senior next year that's going to have that legacy, just like the guys before that person?
Of the current roster, that's the biggest question, because we were expecting someone to step up in the absence of that kind of alpha dog role, like you said, that Perry Ellis, Frank Mason, Devontae Graham, they took on that role as the leader and the face of the team. This team has Dedrick Lawson, but he'll be gone probably after this year, and the rest of the roster is a lot of guys that just haven't had a ton of experience. But Marcus Garrett is one guy that I've always thought that with a jump shot, he's a potential all-conference player, if not more than that. And he's been kind of pretty steady in the time that he's been healthy for Bill Self. He's put in some pretty quality minutes, and now he's finally finding his offensive game. And he's a guy that's kind of looked to gather his other teammates in big moments and kind of been the anchor amid a lot of moving parts here and there. But now he's doubtful for Saturday's game, so that makes things even more interesting for this weekend at least.
So you mentioned the upsets that have happened in Lawrence last year, and obviously the Jayhawks got the Cowboys back in the Big 12 tournament. But Oklahoma State's, it feels like, by most standards against Kansas, has kind of had their number. Obviously, their record is not good against Bill Self, but it seems like they've had his number at times. They're depleted. I mean, they're playing 6 players last night. They have 8, 7 scholarship, and 2 guys on the bench they really don't even want to play. I think that, you're dealing with all of this against Kansas. Bill Self, I think, is a master motivator. Would that be fair to say?
Yes.
I think, he can kind of preach, hey, twice last year, these guys didn't even make the NCAA tournament, and they had your number twice last year. They're going through all this stuff, and if you put Kansas is struggling, but you put their 7 against this 7, Kansas has got the upper hand. But is this an opportunity to kind of exercise those demons? Because you still have a lot of tough games down the stretch for Bill Self. You have Texas Tech again. You have your in-state rival. Is this an opportunity to kind of, have the upper hand and prove that you're still that bully that has 14 straight Big 12 titles?
Yeah, well, it's good timing for Kansas. I mean, there's no good time to lose all these players. But if there was a team, nothing against Oklahoma State in their squad, because they're doing the most of what they're given. But seven scholarship players. That's not something that many teams, I don't think any coach would have an easy time with. So for Kansas, I mean, this is where they have to. Now it's just a point of figuring out who's going to step up in with all these guys, really falling out of the lineup. And we saw Charlie Moore as kind of the first man off the bench for the first time since he's been here earlier this week. So for Kansas, it's just going to be about, not kicking a team when they're down, but taking advantage at least of the situation. Yes, Kansas is hurting, but Oklahoma State, the Cowboys, they're in a probably a much worse position. So this is a chance for at least Kansas to find their footing after really struggling to do so as of recently.
I told Chris and Hallie earlier, no matter what happens, you would almost think that Boynton and Self will shake hands Saturday at midcourt and just say, you want to go have a beer? Because, they both, it won't stop. I mean, the Cowboys have been dealing with it since Mike Boynton took over, and before that, the 3 juniors that Oklahoma State have were recruited by Travis Ford, played for Underwood, and now they're on Boynton, assistant coach arrested by the FBI. I mean, they have been through the ringer. From your perspective up in Lawrence, is there any talk, and I don't expect there to be any, but about what Oklahoma State's been through? Is there any respect out there for Mike Boynton? I think there is amongst coaches, but for guys like yourself, have you been looking at what has been happening in Stillwater, and what's your perspective of Oklahoma State basketball up in Kansas?
I mean, you just have to feel for them, and a lot of the media up here, they're well aware of what's been happening down there, and really just the depletion of a program that's looking for positive things to happen, and like you said, a team that beat Kansas last year in Allen Fieldhouse. So it's just a tough situation to be in. I think Kansas fans and people that have been around that program do understand even a little bit more, just like I said, how they were depleted last year. Not to this extent, and they had a couple top quality players still active, but as shallow as Kansas was down to 8 or 9 total active players at parts last season. So I would imagine that a lot of people around the Kansas program at least have a better understanding of what it's like to play with a roster that's just completely shredded.
Well, final score really quickly for Saturday. I said 29-point victory for the Jayhawks because I really do think it's going to be, it's extra. I mean, they have more legs than the Cowboys, and it's Bill Self exercising some demons. I think it's going to be bad. 29 points may be a little extreme, but it's what I said, so I have to stick with it. What's your final score prediction for Saturday?
Well, Kansas, they're going to have probably a little bit more trouble putting the ball in the basket without their only proven three-point shooter. So, I'm probably calling something low on. Let's go 64-55.
Still a 9-point victory, not quite 29, so it makes a little bit more sense than what I said.
Yeah, a little closer to like my neck of the woods. I think I said, 75-59?
Yeah, well, sometimes you say things into a microphone and you just have to roll with it because it is what it is. It's sports radio. So I mentioned football earlier. Chris is the basketball guy. I'm the football guy.
Sure.
7-6 for the Cowboys was a bit of a disappointment. That's good news for Kansas. They got Les Miles now. Now you have Bill Self via Oklahoma State and Les Miles now via LSU. But Oklahoma State first. So maybe you're stealing some coaches here, but I'll let it slide in football because, and quite frankly, is this maybe Big 12 fans look at this and go, you win 14 straight titles in basketball. This is well deserved. I mean, this is what you guys get for winning 14 straight titles. That may be the sentiment around the Big 12. I'm a little bit worried about Les Miles because he's older now and he's a little crazy, but he can recruit. Jeff Long comes from a football conference, and yeah, he's going to roll with this basketball. Kansas basketball is going to carry itself, but he brings in a really high-profile coach. What's the feeling like in Lawrence going forward for this fall?
I mean, the culture is already changing. You can see it when you're walking down the street and you see a sign up talking about season tickets. People are excited for the first time in a very long time in Lawrence about football here. And you can hit it right on the nose. 100% of that has to do with Les Miles because the pedigree that he brings, just with the name alone, is going to attract more recruits. And we saw the problem with Kansas football was the recruiting. That was the issue that David Beatty could never really figure out. And he put a lot of emphasis on getting a lot of JUCO players and kind of neglecting a lot of high school talent. And that's where Les Miles has already come in. And this week, he was talking earlier during signing day, talking about how he wants to put emphasis almost 100% on recruiting high school players. And we saw the recruiting class, even for 2019, less than 2.5 months into his tenure, he got the recruiting class for this upcoming year from 139th up to 65th is where it stands right now. And he just landed a four-star athlete yesterday. So he's already making waves, both in recruiting and in the community. And I would imagine that KU puts at least a formidable team on the field next fall.
So, Jack, as a also a Minnesota kid here. I got to ask if somehow the Kansas Jayhawks come to Stillwater in the fall here, pull off some sort of upset, does that give Kansas more bragging rights being Les Miles as their coach?
I mean, I would think so. I can't imagine that it would hurt them in any way.
Well, they're doing a ton of renovations to the stadium, and I've never been. I've been to Lawrence. I've seen the stadium. Never been inside, but it by Division I standards and Power 5, the upgrades are much needed. Are they going to put in grass because it's turf now, if I'm not mistaken? And turf is a little bit harder to chew, I think, for Coach Miles. So are they going to put in a grass field here for Les Miles with those upgrades?
I don't anticipate it, but Jeff Long was joking on Twitter a while back how they were possibly just gonna throw a strip of sod behind the sideline just so he would have his own personal stash on game day. But I don't think there's any plans for that anytime soon.
Well, I mean, I think Kansas is in a really good shape. I just have a couple more questions. One's about what's the status of Puka Williams, and number two, did you see Gavin Potter declare for Kansas yesterday?
Yes.
Fan, not a fan?
Sorry, what was that?
For Gavin Potter, were you a fan of what he did yesterday in declaring for the Jayhawks?
Well, that's interesting. It was interesting. Let me say that. I've never been big on recruits making a huge deal of recruiting. Yes, it's a exciting time. It's an interesting time, but kids these days, you feel like they're doing it just for the attention. So It was creative. I will give him that. I've never seen that before, but hopefully he can be as talented as he is creative on the football field.
Well, yeah, certainly when I watched it, I'm like, his parents, they're letting this happen. This is happening right in front of his parents. I can't believe it. But he certainly said some stuff afterwards that he was going to enjoy playing against OU and Oklahoma State because they let him leave Oklahoma. I think the OSU one might be interesting. He might want to slow it down against the Sooners, but time will tell. And that question I asked you about Puka Williams, where's he at in the program right now?
So he had his second court appearance, after the issues with him, and there was rumors of whether he had been involved in domestic violence. They kept the details of the case pretty tight-lipped, but at least from what the media has been told, he's going through a diversion process, so he will be under very watchful eyes. But at this point, I don't think there's going to be any issue with his eligibility moving forward.
So, Jack, your personal opinion, kind of the last question we'll have for you tonight.
Sure.
What is your timeline for Kansas football of when they're actually going to be competitive, in your opinion, in the Big 12, where they start really having a chance to contend for a Big 12 championship?
Well, that's
if ever,
probably that's probably going to be the day when Kansas basketball isn't in contention for a conference. No, I'm kidding. But no, for football, I was really worried. Before the head coach was hired, there was pretty much all the impact players that Kansas had this year already graduated after this past season. So there was a lot of concern about who would even be on the field next year. But Les Miles, he's doing a lot of work in a very brief time. So if this continues at the rate that it's at, I think Kansas football is looking at a potential 500 season this year. And I know 6 wins doesn't sound like a lot to say Oklahoma fans of Oklahoma State football.
It did this year.
How, that's true. But generally speaking, it's been a very, very long time since this community's seen even an average football team. So I would not be surprised if Kansas made a push for bowl eligibility as soon as this fall. I know that's being pretty optimistic, but in terms of competing in the conference, there's just a ton of great teams in the Big 12. So that's going to take a minute, but I don't think there's any better conference for Les Miles to work with than going up against such good competition, because it'll really put his skills to the test. Since being out of football for 3 years.
Well, I think Jeff Long made a home run hire for Kansas football. I think, as you mentioned, they're in much better shape now than they were just a few months ago. I still think Kansas got this wrap on the Big 12 basketball, but I may be wrong. But if you get down here at the end of the season for a game in Galgary, or come down to Boone Pickens next year, just let us know. And Chris is an excellent host. So if you're ever down this way in Stillwater for a game or anything, just let us know. Thanks for coming on.
Absolutely appreciate you guys. Before I go, I will say, I know a lot of people are saying Kansas State is the top of the Big 12, but other than KU, I think Iowa State has to be the team to watch. They're deep, they can shoot, and they can really move the ball.
Real quick, what are your thoughts on Baylor?
They're a good team, but Scott Drew's been known to kind of lose the grip on a lot of big games in key situations. So, they're not the same team as last year either. But the top of the Big 12, there's just so many teams in it right now. It'll be a lot of fun to watch.
All right. Well, hey, thanks a lot for coming on again, Jack.
Hey, thank you guys for having me.